Welcome to Campus Pressbox 58. I'm Kristen Botica, and I am the Deputy Editor of Football, and I have with me today Damon Del Rosario. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great.
So you are more of a basketball writer, though, right? Not a football writer?
Yeah, I do a lot of the college basketball throughout the season, but I watch all sports and I love them all, so no problem jumping in for some football.
Awesome. That's good to know. I mean, I'm kind of the opposite. I watch a lot of basketball, but I talk a lot of football.
Nice.
All right, so I'm just going to jump right in here, actually.
Sure.
I want to take it back to last week, the first week of play, and I want to know two things we learned from last week's games that kind of surprised you.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the biggest one for me was the Oklahoma Houston game, and that not only did Oklahoma lose, which I thought it was, was certainly a possibility, although for some reason I blacked out and decided to pick them to cover 12 and a half points. So part of the first weekend was me learning that you should take a few steps back before you do that. But the way Oklahoma got dominated for the majority of that game, I watched the opening drive and they went right down the field and punched in a score, and it looked like they were going to do what we kind of expected Oklahoma to do. But the rest of the way, Houston pushed them around. They pressured them. They pressured the quarterback constantly. Their defense pretty much locked up Oklahoma for the rest of the way. And that I thought was just a huge surprise to me that that they would get just pushed around that way. Again, considering that they had a top 15 matchup to start the season, and they were supposed to be the better team by far. So that was shocking to me.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. I kind of had a similar feeling, especially when I first started watching that game, because it seemed like Oklahoma had it under control that very first drive there. But then after that, I can't really explain what happened to them. It kind of, reminds me of how Tennessee does sometimes. So it's very reminiscent of that. It was kind of the opposite of that Tennessee game for me last year, which was just miserable. Um, but I was surprised that Houston was able to hang in there that whole time. That's what caught me off guard, because I didn't know that they would be able to play up a full four quarters against Oklahoma, because I still think Oklahoma is a great team, but obviously now I have more doubts than I did before.
Yeah, and I thought it would just be a shootout. I thought, kind of along the same lines is that they'd put up points, but they would never be able to stop Oklahoma, and so that's where the Sooners would wear them out over the rest of the game. But that just flat out didn't happen.
Yeah, I was definitely surprised by that one too. So what's another thing that surprised you last week?
Well, and you mentioned Tennessee. Certainly Tennessee struggling and having to essentially find a miracle at the end in order to beat Appalachian State. I mean, I know everyone kept hearkening back to when Appalachian State beat Michigan, a few years ago, but that was so long ago now that it's not the same team. So the fact that kept being brought up, I mean, I didn't expect at all for Tennessee, especially since they've been sort of, I know they were very much a great program in the 90s and then had taken some steps back, and then it seems like they've kind of been back on an upswing. But then to start out the season, and maybe that'll be a wake-up call, and they won't have another one like that. But just for them to struggle so bad and be held to 3 points the majority of the way, and then having to come back and then get a fumble in the end zone to win was just, again, that was tremendously shocking to me.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree with that one again too. That I was holding my breath for about all four quarters of that game there. Even, in the overtime period, especially with that fumble, because I was ready to get my pitchfork and chase after Josh Dobbs this week. Um, I mean, I think that goes along with some of the other things that surprised me this week too. I mean, just the SEC in general surprised me a lot, and not in a good way.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of expect the SEC East to be a dumpster fire. That's the word that Damien and I like to use for it, or the phrase. It's a dumpster fire in the SEC East because, you have Kentucky and Vanderbilt, and South Carolina's now kind of pushed around, and Missouri too at this point.
Right.
But then to have the SEC West really struggle too, and to struggle against some of the teams that they struggled against was pretty ridiculous. Like Mississippi State lost to South Alabama.
Yeah. I mean, another one was just baffling.
Yeah, and Arkansas had to, like, I think they came back to beat Louisiana Tech, and they only beat them by a point. So that kind of caught me off guard too. And obviously, Ole Miss imploded, and they had the first half of that game. They absolutely ran over Florida State, but then in the second half, they couldn't do anything. And Chad Kelly had 3 interceptions in that game, which was that caught me by surprise. I didn't expect him to be quite so sloppy.
Yeah, and I think that's the one thing that I find so sort of interesting about college football is that, and I actually had, like I said, I know every once in a while I'll interject my gambling just I guess tendency into some of these podcasts because of the fact that it's another angle of the whole thing that I've always found so intriguing is that when you have to play the spread and you have to kind of try and figure these teams out. Week 1's always the worst week, and I had Florida State, and I turned the thing off because they were down 20. 20. I don't know if it was 28-6 or somewhere in that range, and to have them come back and just kind of dominate the whole way through, and then to be able to easily cover that number. Some of these teams I don't know what they do when they get in the middle of the game that they just lose their minds kind of, and that as you mentioned, the SEC was that way. I mean, Ole Miss did that, and obviously they're playing a pretty great Florida State team. But Kentucky was up 35-10 on Southern Mississippi, and they lose by 11. and then obviously the Mississippi State and the Arkansas games. A conference like the SEC we would think would have the kind of preparation and to be ready for some of these teams, and then just week 1 look like they're in a complete lag.
Yeah, that really caught me off guard. And the ACC also kind of in a different way caught me off guard because I still think of the ACC as a basketball conference more than anything, and I think a lot of people do. It's helped to have Florida State and Clemson recently, but other than that, you don't really think about them as a football conference. And the way that they performed this past weekend, even though a lot of their games were those cakewalk games, those games, they absolutely crushed the opponent. So it wasn't even a contest. It wasn't like they were struggling against the Southern Miss teams or, things like that. They actually were completely blowing the competition out of the water. And then when they did play SEC teams, they had a 2-1 record against the SEC. And that, not only did it surprise me, but it also kind of hurt my feelings a little bit. I'm a big SEC fan over here. I was impressed by the ACC.
Well, that's funny, and you mentioned. I'm a Louisville fan, so the ACC is what I'll focus on an awful lot. But again, because I'm a basketball guy, yeah, absolutely. The ACC, that's what they're known for. Their whole sort of metamorphosis over the years of being, kind of when they formed sort of the football conference with, probably 8-10 teams, and now they've amassed this huge glut of teams like the power conferences do, and. Yeah, you have your big names like the Florida State, the Clemson. Miami's not what they once were still. They haven't gotten back to that level. So, if they were at their normal 1990s, early 2000s level, then the ACC would definitely be a power conference, but they're still not there. The way they've competed and kind of started things out, and they have some teams that, may have an ability to challenge, for whether it's a national title or at the very least, mix things up come playoff time. Between Clemson, Florida State, and I'm hoping my Louisville guys can be in that mix too. So, and then to see North Carolina play Georgia, and they had the lead in that game for a fair amount of that, and then just sort of melted down at the end a little bit. But it's definitely becoming much more of a power conference.
So you said that you're a Louisville fan. That
Yes.
kind of brings me to my next point a little bit. It depends on your point of view on this, but I'm wondering who you have as maybe 1 or 2 potential Heisman candidates, like really early in the season front runners at this point.
Well, yeah, and absolutely, my guy Lamar Jackson is one that I'm looking at and I'm sure he'd be considered a dark horse at this point. But I think for Jackson in particular, especially with the fact that Louisville's, they started out ranked, so they have a good chance to, based on. Again, I don't want to say a weaker ACC schedule because they do have Clemson and Florida State, but there are some teams in there that they can almost chalk up wins as long as they don't stumble. But then he's going to have those showcase games like the Florida State, like the Clemson, and both of those are before October 1st, or by October 1st. So he's going to have a couple of big opportunities that if they can pull off upsets, he has huge games, and then finish out the year with the toughest matchup being Houston. And if Houston continues to do hopefully what they started out the season doing, that could be a big time matchup at the end of the year for him to be able to showcase his Heisman resume. So I think he has a good shot from that standpoint of if things go right to put himself right in the mix for the Heisman Trophy.
I mean, that's very fair, especially after that performance the other night. I didn't even know who he was before then, honestly. I'll be perfectly honest about that one, but that kind of put him on everybody's radar nationally. Is there another player besides maybe your guy that you could think of that you have as a Heisman candidate right now?
Well, I mean, like I said, I think some of the some of this team got let out of someone like Leonard Fournette, who I think was obviously a preseason. Not that he can't still end up totally dominating and be in that mix. Like I said, Lamar Jackson, the one I was so focused on. Like I said, I don't really have one in particular. I guess that I guess I've identified. I know people are super high on DeShone Kizer now from Notre Dame, and like I said, his name's being thrown out there. But I don't know. Are there any others? I guess that you've started to tab as far as your Heisman opinion?
Yeah, there are a few actually. I would say Dalvin Cook's definitely in the mix. He had a pretty good game, even though he had that forced fumble by Manti Te'o's invisible girlfriend in that game. He did have a pretty good game after that point, and he wasn't just rushing, he was actually receiving. That's where he had more yardage, was on the receiving end. So that was actually kind of impressive for me to see that much, and he had almost 200 yards all told on offense. So, I mean, Dalvin Cook is obviously still very much in the mix for me, but his rushing game wasn't impressive, so that's what kind of threw me off a little bit is, are they going to be able to get him on the ground and get him averaging more than he averaged, because that's obviously, he averaged, I think it was maybe about 4 yards per carry, so I would expect him to average maybe a little bit more than that, maybe like 5 or 6 yards at least, but because of his receiving, I still have him definitely in the mix there.
And he's one that, and like I said, unfortunately, I've had to watch him up close and personal. It was just a couple years ago that Louisville had a huge lead on Florida State when Jameis Winston was still there, and then Dalvin Cook absolutely shredded them the rest of the way. So yeah, I mean he's impressive.
Yeah, I've had to watch him too, being a Florida Gator. I'm a Vol and a Gator, which is always a hot topic here at Campus Pressbox. But I've had to watch him as a Gator, and that's not been very pleasant the past few years. So what do you think about Deshaun Watson? Because I know Clemson didn't have the best game against Auburn. I don't know if you watched that game or, paid attention to the stats and how it all played out. But do you think he's still very much at the top of the talk for the Heisman?
Yeah, I mean, he'll game one certainly was that low scoring, and I watched some of it. It was one that I kind of had on while I was flicking around other games. So, it wasn't that super impressive game one that you hope for out of a Heisman candidate. But just over the years watching him, and especially I know last year in the national championship game, just watching him, I think he spins the ball better than just about anybody out there. So I think the way he just drops passes on guys, and they're going to have some matchups where he's going to put up the 5-6 touchdowns and get himself back to where the numbers start matching up with what everyone wants to see as far as a Heisman candidate. So I don't doubt that he'll be in the mix.
So moving forward, also, one that I noticed, because I'm, like I said, a big SEC girl, I noticed Nick Chubb. I mean, it's been a lot of anticipation because he went out pretty early in the season last year, so everybody was very eager for him to come back at Georgia. But when he came back with a vengeance. He had 222 yards rushing, which is, I think that's absolutely incredible. I think that right there put him at the top of everybody's list right now.
Yeah, and I like Nick Chubb a lot, and like you said, it's hard to kind of look back a couple years ago when he started, popping back up on the scene, and it was, because he was sort of coming in when Todd Gurley was, finishing up or whatever, maybe sort of replacing him. So, and then last year, with the knee injury, you begin to forget about some of these guys. But I watched a good majority of that game, and it was brutal because I did have North Carolina also in that one. So, unfortunately, Nick Chubb ran all over them and looked like they had no defense at all because he absolutely shredded them. And he's a little power back, just low center of gravity, and he's going to kill it. And then, yeah, they're going to get some teams in the SEC where he gets those 3-4 touchdown opportunities, which again is what ends up putting you up at the top of the Heisman ballot with the big stat stuffing.
Yeah, do you think that that kind of schedule, having an easier schedule, especially, I mean, Nick Chubb plays in the SEC East, and the East is notoriously easier than the West. Do you think that that helps him in his, I mean, search for the Heisman, I guess, or his campaign for the Heisman?
Yeah, and it's very similar to, I guess, what I would say about Lamar Jackson, except for the fact that with the SEC, you get an even better, just even better perception of the schedule and a better perception of the candidate, because he's going to get those easy games and put up a ton of numbers, but then they're going to have the opportunities for showcase games. So then he's really out there, and if they pull off those wins, then it elevates him even more, as opposed to ending up with an 8-5 season, and then even the stats don't typically save the Heisman candidates when they end up on a team like that's kind of middle of the road or middle ranking, because they don't win those showcase games. So being in the SEC, having that opportunity not only to put up numbers against the easier teams, but then to have that showcase game and pull it off, that's that's a good opportunity to rise up the rankings.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. And I'm going to throw out one more. I would consider him very much a dark horse candidate at this point, but I'm going to throw out one more name here just because it's kind of a devil's advocate thing. But what about DeAndre Francois for Florida State?
Honestly, I don't know that much about him. Like I said, I'd really lean on you, I guess, to give me his pedigree, because I only got to watch some of that, so I didn't get a real good feel for him at this point.
Well, I can kind of run through his stats for that game. He was a redshirt last year, so he took a season. What I said before this season started is, that kind of gives him a unique perspective on things, because he gets to sit and watch the team from the sidelines and see how it works. So he gets to watch that kind of like coaches watch it, instead of just automatically being thrown in there right off the bat as a freshman. So in a way, I thought that that might be helpful to him. But in the game on Monday, he was 33 of 52, so that's a little over 63% completion. And he had 419 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. And that's against Ole Miss. Ole Miss has a good defense. They lost some of their key players in their defense during that game, but he also had 59 yards rushing on 9 attempts. That's over a 6-yard average there,
Wow.
too.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, talk about a start. So you look for that game one start to boost that, especially that early hype. And I think everyone gets so used to talking about, even the media, when they want to hype guys, they get so used to talking about the same candidates. So when someone like that jumps up, suddenly they get excited, and that game one hype that you build off of that can be huge. So and obviously, if Florida State ends up having the kind of season that that we know Florida State can, and they end up in the the Final Four playoff mix, then suddenly his name becomes a hot one at the end of the season.
Yeah, the only thing that I think could potentially hurt him is being on the same team as Dalvin Cook, because
Right.
it's kind of hard to compete against somebody like Dalvin Cook, because Dalvin Cook had fantastic statistics the other night too, except for his drop incident. But, I feel like it might make it a little bit hard on him. That's why I really think he's a dark horse, and especially since this is his first year leading the team. But if not this year, then maybe next year instead, at least.
Well, that's the one great thing about, I think, with college football, is that, and I guess it's great, and at the same time it drives me a little crazy, is that the games have so many, I guess they're so long, and there's so many opportunities to put up big numbers that, I mean, yeah, both guys can end up having that Heisman pedigree. I think of like a Leinart and Reggie Bush type of thing, where both guys are going to be, if they're successful, they're winning spotlight games, and they're both putting up huge numbers, especially since you get some of those weaker squads in the ACC, and they, each one of them, he has a couple of passing touchdowns. Dalvin Cook rushes for a couple more or 3, and they blow someone out, 50-10. They both can build their resumes at the same time.
Yeah, I think that might actually play out pretty interesting when it comes down to it for the Heisman this season. Now I'm ready to jump ahead to this weekend, and I want to know what 2 games, I know there's not a lot of great matchups this weekend comparatively speaking, but what 2 games do you have on your radar?
Well, certainly as a Louisville Cardinal fan, I've got them on my radar first. Especially, I really drives me crazy when they play a team like Charlotte, only because as much as I know you want to get a nice win off the bat to start the season, I'd rather they played, a little bit. I don't care if it was a MAC school or one of the other mid-major squads and win that game. But because of that, coming off of such an easy opponent, they always tend to struggle with Syracuse, at the very least in the Carrier Dome. So I'll be interested to see, how they handle that off of such an easy matchup. Here's your first conference game, and a place that they've tended to have to eke out wins. So, and it's Lamar Jackson's second opportunity to really, again, start to build that Heisman pedigree. If he can blow them out of the water and put up another 4 or 5 touchdowns, then he's off to an awesome start there. But I have a feeling they're going to not necessarily stub the toe, but have an opportunity or late still have a chance to come out of there with a loss. So I'm hoping that I'm wrong, but I'll have my eye on that one. For those couple of different reasons, the fact that again they always seem to struggle there, and Lamar Jackson has a chance to really highlight his abilities. The second one that I looked at, and as you mentioned, there's not a ton of. I don't even know if there's a ranked matchup, but the one that I looked up that I think is really intriguing is Alabama and Western Kentucky. Western Kentucky's been sort of under the radar successful. I know they play in Conference USA and no one really pays too much attention, but they could be a thorn in people's sides. And I think the style they play, it'll be interesting if they can keep up with Alabama, even for a part of the game. They've gotten blown out when they've played them anytime recently, but it's Alabama's just that machine, and we saw what they can do. Would they possibly take their foot off the gas? Would they week 2 sort of have a little bit of a slumber after blowing out USC in week 1? So I'll be interested to see if Western Kentucky can for a little bit maybe put up a couple of touchdowns, bother them a little bit, and maybe get late into that game.
That could be interesting. I didn't think about that one, actually. That's not one of mine, so you didn't steal one of mine. So we have plenty to talk about now. I actually have 3, but that's only because I'm actually attending one game this week.
Oh, nice.
Too. The first one that actually kind of intrigues me, and especially after last weekend, is Arkansas at TCU. Because we talked about Arkansas had that 21-20 close win over Louisiana Tech, and that was at home. The problem that they had in that game, part of it at least, was that Austin Allen, their quarterback, he had a pretty decent completion percentage and he had 2 touchdowns, but he also had 2 interceptions. So can they clean that up and clean it up on the road against a pretty good Big 12 squad? But you also have TCU, who played South Dakota State last weekend and won by 18 points, but it was a really high-scoring game. It was 59-41. So they let somebody like South Dakota State put up a lot of points on the board.
And they trailed in that for a while.
Yeah, I'm a little bit against TCU. I think they're a little bit overrated at this point still, but that's part of why I think this game is kind of intriguing, because Arkansas has that upset factor. They always will.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that game, and I mean with Kenny Hill, just seeing how he settles into. I liked watching him at A&M for that 1 year, but it's kind of interesting to see him in a different conference and on a different team, really. And right. He did pretty well in the first game as well. He had like 400-something yards passing and a really high completion percentage too. But again, he had 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. So I think it's going to come down to the turnovers for these 2 in this game.
Right.
And then another one, this is kind of like you with your Louisville game. Since I'm a Florida Gator, I'm especially interested in Kentucky at Florida. Because Kentucky, everybody saw Kentucky completely blew it this first weekend. They blew a 25-point lead against Southern Miss, of all people, and at home. Yeah. So that was kind of insane. I couldn't believe that when it happened. But how are they going to bounce back from that? Are they going to come out really, really hungry? Are they going to arrive in the swamp like ready to take that victory, whatever it takes? And then you have Florida, too, because Florida, I don't know if you saw any of that game. I was holding my breath for about 3 quarters. They played UMass at home, and it took them literally over 3 quarters to finally start pulling away from UMass, of all people.
Yeah, I kept seeing the score on that one just on the trail, and I never never found it on TV, and like I said, from the looks of it, I'm pretty sure I didn't necessarily want to, because it didn't look like it was that intriguing of a game. But yeah, other than the fact that they took so long to take over in that one.
Yeah, I mean, Florida, I obviously am a huge Florida fan, so I know a lot about their team and a lot about what to expect. We didn't have our best cornerback, probably, if not the best corner in the country, one of the best corners in Jalen Tabor. But that shouldn't completely dismantle our defense, and our defense had a lot of penalties against them. The final score, 24-7, that one 7-point drive for UMass was a drive where Florida handed them 35 yards on penalties. So Florida really kind of has to get their act together and clean things up. But are they going to be able to do that over a Kentucky team that's probably really hungry to prove themselves now?
Yeah, and I think Kentucky typically, or at least the last few years, has given Florida a little bit of fits. Since, again, it's funny. I mean, Florida is just another one of those kind of traditional powers from before that hasn't really found their legs again, at least to get into the upper echelon of teams. So yeah, I have a feeling that Kentucky's going to come out firing, and obviously really agitated after last week. So that could be an absolute dogfight.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be an interesting one for me. I'll be checking the score on my phone, and maybe somebody will have it at the tailgate that I'm at. Now, the game that I'm going to, I've been looking forward to this game for 2 years now, because I've known that we were going to have tickets. But I am going to the Tennessee-Virginia Tech game at Bristol Motor Speedway.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, so obviously for me, it already would be at the top of my list of games to watch this weekend. Virginia Tech struggled in the first half against, I think it was Liberty that they played this past week, so they aren't completely solid right now. Right. And then obviously you talked about Tennessee with Appalachian State. That was just mind-blowing, and they had to get lucky to win that game, really. So, seeing both of those two teams come in here and be at a neutral site in front of 150,000 fans, that's going to be really, really interesting.
Yeah, like I said, another one of those bounce-back performance games, as you mentioned, and Virginia Tech certainly doesn't appear to be, the Virginia Tech, I guess, of old. And so I keep coming back to that theme, but they're one that's just not the same team that they were, 8-10 years ago. So I got to think that Tennessee is going to be super focused for that one as well, because of the fact that they struggled mightily. But you just never know, and especially in that kind of a setting, while it's a, quote unquote neutral site game still in the state of Tennessee, you got to think that they're going to be feeling like it's a home game, and they're going to have to play well in order to get that crowd riled up.
Oh yeah, and I think a lot of it too. I personally wasn't very impressed with the play calling in Tennessee's game on Thursday night. I have had a lot of issues with Butch Jones and his coaching, and especially the way that they've run their offense. Because they haven't run it enough, really, because they really just have a running offense, and they haven't taken advantage of all that they have there, all of the talent that they have. So I think a huge part of this is going to be Tennessee's running game. Can they actually get their running game going? Are they actually going to get their backs, both of their backs involved? It's Alvin Kamara and Jalen Hurd, and then also get Josh Dobbs running it too. If they can get all of that together, then I think they can pretty easily take over this game. But whether or not they can get that is still a question, because it didn't look like they had that going for them last Thursday.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's definitely a game that I'm looking forward to. I will make sure to blow up everybody's Slack channels with all sorts of fun stuff from that game.
Well, yeah, hopefully you're not on high alert like last week and sitting on the absolute edge of your seat because of the fact that Tennessee comes out with another slow start or clunker. But I have a feeling they're going to probably get that crowd going, because they should be coming out firing and ready to play week 2.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of, too, what happened with them last week, I think they kind of got humbled in a way. And I think for a team like that, it's actually really good that they get humbled before this kind of game, because if they had just run over Appalachian State, then I think they might have overlooked this Virginia Tech matchup a little bit more.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it gives me a little bit more hope for them in a way that they struggled so much in that game, because maybe now they know what their weaknesses are and they can address it and look at the film. But Aside from me even going to that game, that and the Arkansas TCU game are my two biggest games this weekend that I'm really caring about, and I'm really interested to see what happens.
Absolutely.
So, one last thing, and I didn't give you a heads up on this, but I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you have to choose your 4 playoff teams right now, who are you going with?
Oh gosh, my 4 playoff teams right now. Well, I mean, easily enough, Alabama, because I don't think anything will stand in their way. I think personally, I mean, I think that Clemson will end up back at least in that mix. I see them probably being a little bit better than Florida State. I think surprise. I don't know if I want to call it a surprise. I mean, they're certainly a high-ranked team, but I think that Ohio State doesn't necessarily get the kind of credit this year. I think people thought they would take a little bit of a step back. I think Ohio State will be there, and then I think, like I said, out west we're going to get one, and I don't know why. I just feel like they're going to sort of they've been off the radar for a while as a top echelon team. I think we'll see Washington sneak in there and get that West Coast team in that top 4.
All right, that's pretty fair. I can definitely agree with Alabama right now, especially. I mean, they came out with a vengeance. I didn't expect them to run over USC the way that they did. And I have Ohio State on mine too. I actually am picking Florida State over Clemson right now. But that's mostly because of I feel like they have more talent on the offensive side of the ball.
Right.
So that's why I kind of am leaning towards them at this point. But it'll be interesting to see how the ACC plays out because I'm not sure that both Florida State and Clemson would go. So I think it'll be one or the other there. But I'm definitely looking forward to the rest of this season and kind of finding out more about these teams after what was a pretty crazy first weekend in college football.
No doubt.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up now. And can you tell everybody how they can find you?
Sure. You can find me, you can email me at Campus Pressbox at damon.delrosario at campuspressbox.com and on Twitter at Damo Knows Sports.
All right, awesome. And you guys can find me on Twitter at OGKristen, KristenB. And you can also email me at kristen.botica at campuspressbox.com. So that's going to be it for Campus Pressbox 58, and I look forward to podcasting with you again later this season, maybe.
Sounds great, Kristen.